Hello and welcome to another Plane Truce, and this week we're going to be talking about load and balancing. Joining me as always is your friend, it's my friend, it's everyone's friend, it is the legend that is Captain Al. Hi Captain Al.
Hello there, how are you doing?
Yes, I'm very good, thank you, very good. So, I suspect literally this is probably quite a loaded question.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear.
Well,
You've been spent ages on that one, haven't you?
We'll gloss over that and move on. So my question today is very, very simple, probably to you anyway. But obviously, we've been hearing stories of late in these, shall we say, very strange times, where airliners, which were perhaps just ferrying mostly people around, are doing chores where they're carrying freight. Now, I knew that freight was always being carried by passenger airliners and stuff. So, I mean, what really are the processes in deciding how you load the aircraft? And does that have an impact about where passengers can sit, for example? So are there areas that are blocked off because of the load that's underneath that you as a passenger are completely unaware of?
Okay, so let's go back a few steps and consider the fact that an aeroplane has limits as to how much weight it can carry and where that weight is situated. So quite clearly, if you put all the weight in the back of the aeroplane, you run the risk of it tipping onto its tail. If you put all the weight on the front of the aeroplane, you run the risk of it not being able to get airborne on takeoff. It's just a simple equation, really. An aeroplane's very much like a seesaw, a kid's seesaw. So you need to manage where the center of gravity is quite carefully. So when they design the aeroplane, they create what's called an envelope. So it's basically a geometrical shape, and it determines as a function of one side of the graph the weight, and on the other axis of the graph where the center of gravity is allowed to exist. So like I say, you can't put a load of heavy people in the tail and expect the aeroplane to not tip on its tail. It's balanced on wheels on the ground, and it's aerodynamically balanced in flight. So we have those limits. Quite clearly, there are weight limits and there are balance limits. So when we load an aeroplane, we have to keep the load, whether it be passengers or freight or bags or anything else that we're putting on the aeroplane, within that envelope. We normally do that by electronic means. Now, typically, an aeroplane that's being used for passenger transport, so like a 320 or a 737, has the ability to be full of passengers and be within its loading limitations. Clearly, it's not a lot of point having an aeroplane if you say, fill all the seats, but you can't then take off because it's out of balance. So they create an aeroplane that has operational functionality. But you can encounter unusual circumstances that falls outside of what the designers thought would be the normal role. So one example of that would be, say, for example, the carriage of PPE, which I'll come to in just a sec. But there are occasions, for example, where, say, on an A321, which is by nature quite a tail-heavy aeroplane. So naturally, when it's kind of empty, there's a fair amount of weight in the tail. It's quite a long aeroplane, so just like a seesaw, if you put weight down the tail, like the APU, then the longer the lever is, the more of a moment it has. So when we are loading and unloading the A321, we have to be careful that we don't end up with too much weight, i.e. passengers, bags or cargo in the tail and not enough at the front. And it will quite happily sit on its tail if you don't manage that carefully. So equally, when you're attempting to fly the aeroplane, there are scenarios where you have to give some consideration. So if, for example, you fill an A321 up with people, so about 220 people, but for whatever reason, none of those people have any suitcases. So say, for example, they're just on a day trip, so they're not taking any luggage with them. you cannot then fill the aeroplane up with fuel unless you put ballast in. So in other words, lots of big bags of sand or water to balance it out. Now, not many airports have several tons of ballast just lying around. So it's not uncommon to use bottled water as ballast because, of course, you can then take it off and reuse it. You can argue about the merits of having lots of water sloshing around the aircraft, but ultimately, if that's what you have to do, that's what you have to do. So there are some careful loading issues to be resolved. Now, when we've started to use passenger aircraft for the carriage of PPE, there are some issues. First of all, PPE is relatively light, but it's quite bulky. But if you put lots and lots of boxes of relatively light stuff in, it still does have weight and therefore has to be carefully loaded and, importantly, secured. So initially, when we started seeing passenger aircraft being used to carry PPE, we saw lots of boxes kind of being secured into seats with seat belts and so forth. And the regulators and the manufacturers looked around, no, we're not happy about that. Because if you've ever tried to secure a box in your car with a seatbelt, it's just not designed to do that. It's designed to fit around a human being, not something that's square. And we tend to be a bit more round. So then you started to see aircraft with PPE in boxes in seats, but then big cargo nets put over the top of it. And then more latterly, people have taken the seats out of aircraft and then been able to use more conventional sort of securing methods. But nonetheless, it is still a very delicate balancing act, no pun intended, to get the weight and balance within the correct envelope. Not least because you have to operate it safely, but depending on where you've got the weight and balance of the aircraft has quite a considerable impact on the fuel burn. So if you have all the weight down one end, for example, the front, that's not very efficient because you've got to pull the nose up to fly. So on some of the bigger aircraft, so like A320, there is a fuel tank in the tail, and the aircraft will move fuel fore and aft to basically affect the balance of the aeroplane in flight. And we always used to joke with some of the more heavyweight cabin crew that when we used to have our lunch served to us and the heavyweight cabin crew would come to the front, we would then have to pump fuel down the back to counteract their weight suddenly moving forward. They used to joke that it was simply the weight of our food that they were having to bring to satisfy our appetites.
Okay. And so the banter continues. Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, to be honest, the problems don't really vary from wide body to narrow body. It's just a simple fact that the bigger the aircraft, if you like, the more opportunity there are to fit things in and for not to have an effect. It's just a scale of proportion. So in a small aeroplane, sort of like a PA-28, the weight of the person sat in row 2 is significant. But in an A380, the weight of the person sat in row 2 is less significant because there are a lot more rows. So wide body, narrow body, it's not really a case of how many aisles there are. It's more a function of the size of the aeroplane. So, and indeed, if you fly on some of the small aircraft that are used as public transport airliners, if you like, so say, for example, inter-island flights in Scotland, or in the Channel Islands, you will actually physically, as a passenger, get on a weighing scales so that they know your exact weight for weight and balance. On larger aircraft, we use something called standard weights, which are just average weights, because whether someone is 75 kilos or 80 kilos, that 5 kilos isn't a big deal on the grand scheme of things if you're carrying 230 tons of weight. But on a small aeroplane, yeah, it's a big deal. Wow. Is that helpful?
Absolutely, and that is a brilliant place to bring a rather sort of, it's great, you've simplified a very complicated subject, which I'm grateful for. Captain Al, as always, many thanks.
You're most welcome.
If you'd like to watch more from our great series, then you can do that by pressing here. We've also created you a playlist with all the Plain Truth episodes, and you'll find that just here. Why not like and subscribe to our channel? That way you will be notified whenever we post our great content. Or if you've got a question that you'd like Captain Al to answer, then why not pop it in the comments box below, and you may well feature on an upcoming episode of The Plain Truth.